Okay, so this is Dirk again, and I would like to cover a very, very basic concept in 3D model editing. This concept will not cover how to create 3D shapes and models, but rather how to UV map them using the software known as Blender. So what I do is I launch Blender. It's going to tell me that it's Blender version 2.71. And within Blender, there are many keyboard combinations that accelerate the use of Blender, even if the mouse is a bit crippled. Blender will always start with a cube as its default shape for editing. It's easy to delete. You simply hit the delete key because the cube is already selected. What I'd like to do is I'd like to make this cube a little larger. So I hit the S key for scale, and then I simply move the mouse in any direction to change the size of this default cube. There it is. So I've made it slightly larger. Now, in order to UV map this cube, we have to both know how to use Blender and understand what we're telling it to do. This cube consists of 8 vertices, because a cube has 8 corners, and each of these vertices currently only has a 3-dimensional position as it's being shown in front of you. We would like each vertex additionally to get a U and a V texture coordinate to be mapped to a texture image of our choice. Sounds very straightforward. It's a bit complicated with Blender. So the thing is, the first thing we'd like to do is we'd like to split our screen so that we have 2 useful work areas. We right-click the border region at the bottom of the screen we want to split, and we left-click on Split Area. Then we get to choose how big or small we want to make our new areas. So we'll roughly cut it in half like this. And we now have 2 displays that are roughly in the same mode. Right? We've split the screen, we've created 2 working areas. The one on the right is going to become the one in which we do the UV mapping. So down here where we have the 3D object view, the 3D viewport, we change it to our UV image editor, which turns into a general purpose viewer for 2-dimensional images that currently doesn't have an image loaded. Also, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take the toolbar on the right on my laptop and make it a bit wider because it's not showing me all the options. So in this case, we don't right-click, we select the border region and we hold down the left mouse key and we drag this until we see the bouncy ball so that we know that we can actually edit all the properties of the selected object. The bouncy ball that I'm referring to over here is the last category of properties that we can edit. It's for physics. We don't need that right now. So the thing is that I've selected my cube on the left. I'm going to leave that alone for the moment, and I'm going to tell my image editor on the right to open an image that I already have. So I just clicked on Open, and it starts at the root directory, which is a bit of a pain for Windows systems because most of us don't store our personal data. We go into Users under Windows 8.1. We go into my username, and then once we're in my username, I can go into my Documents folder. I can go into a subfolder that I like, and within that subfolder, I have a My Pictures folder. And within My Pictures, I'm going to choose this picture, which is called ABC August 28th. That's all it's called, -000-JPEG. You may notice that I'm selecting a JPEG image here without any hesitation, because a lot of the modern editors, at least, will allow you to do so. When you're finally loading these images into your game engine, you do not have that luxury. They have to be bitmapped in some way. They have to be TGA images for if they have an alpha component or some other bitmapped image. Right now it's a compressed JPEG image. It's a nice artistic design that was being broadcast on ABC years and years ago. So my image editor on the right now shows an image that I've opened and shows me nothing else. What I really want is I want for the cube to map itself to this image. So the thing is that within the toolbar on the right, we can easily select which of our objects we're editing the properties of, and cube is already selected. There's the object cube happens to be called cube. And it is highlighted, and there is a materials tab here for it. And what the materials do is they add parameters to the surface properties of the cube. They will not be very important when we're using UV mapping to control the surface properties, but they offer us a preview so that we can see if we've done anything wrong. Now, another tab right after the materials tab is the actual textures tab. Now, it's already telling us that within the object cube, there's a subsection called material under which there's texture. There's a default texture name called text that tells us absolutely nothing. We can add more textures, but the most important thing to do for the moment is to tell Blender what type of texture we'd like to work with. We'd like to work with a predefined image, because there could be all kinds of textures that are parametric, that produce noise patterns based on math. We want an image or movie to be our texture type. And so we've done that. And instead of creating a new image for editing within Blender, which is what new would allow us to do, that's not really very feasible because Blender is meant for 3D, not for 2D. We open an existing texture image. So on here, now that we've selected the type of texture the text is going to be, we get to select the image that we load into it. And again, it lands us in the root directory of a Windows hard drive. So I go to my personal folder again, and I'm going to open the same image that I opened before a second time. So I'm deliberately doing this within Blender, and I'm deliberately opening. That was a bit of a glitch. I accidentally selected more than one, but it opened the first one. So I'm deliberately going to open the same image the second time. ABC August 28th 000.jpg. And I open it, and now the texture editor within the toolbar is showing me the same image that I've got in the image viewer. Now the thing is that right now I haven't done anything to edit the actual model file. I can go into the material if I want, and I can see what I presently have, and it's going to be only slightly different from what I had before. So if I look at the materials editor, there seems to be some detail on this sphere. This preview would also reveal reflectivity if we wanted to. But if we actually turn the shape of the preview model for this material into a cube, we'd notice that the image that we've selected has only been mapped onto one face of the cube. And that is what we are now going to remedy, because UV mapping is all about how do we map the three-dimensional object to the texture image, really. One important concept to remember in Blender is that in order to do UV mapping, we must switch our editor from object mode into edit mode. And the reason for that is because UV mapping takes place on a vertex for vertex basis. So then it makes sense that we would find the tools in edit mode and not in object mode. So now our three-dimensional cube is in edit mode, and we notice that we've got a new tab over here on the sidebar on the left which says shading and UVs. And so I've selected the shading and UVs tab of the sidebar, and under UV mapping there is an unwrap command. What does the unwrap command do? It suggests a possible set of UV coordinates as a starting point. So if we tell it to unwrap, it's going to derive UV coordinates from the 3D vertex coordinates. So there are a variety of projections, including the cylinder projection and the sphere projection that we can choose. We're going to use a cube projection because it's consistent with having a cube. And so now that we click on it, we notice that in our image view on the right, we have this pattern of checkerboards, this pattern of grids. I'm going to just make this thing a bit smaller. We have this pattern of UV maps superimposed onto our image, we see that the image was never a square image. It was an arbitrary photograph that I picked out. Ideally, for UV mapping, you would use not only square images, but square images that have a size that are a power of 2, like 1024 squared or 2048 by 2048. Blender is playing along with my premises and telling me, okay, you can use the image if you want. I'm going to go ahead and UV map this according to it being a cube. And the vertices in the UV map editor are superimposed. Every one of these dots corresponds to potentially more than one actual vertex belonging to the model. Okay, so the thing is that we've created an unwrapping of the three-dimensional coordinates into UV coordinates according to an arbitrary projection, and we're noticing that in the materials preview, nothing has changed. And that's to be expected because the materials preview is heavily biased for software rendering. And yet when we prepare a model for use within a game engine, what we would like it to do is we would like it to render in a non-material, non-software environment, which is the whole point of the exercise. So the thing is that in my toolbar, I have under mapping 2 entries that are of extreme importance. I have coordinates that's set to generated, and I've got projection that's set to flat. I could make a mistake here, and I could simply decide that I'm going to change my projection to cubic again because I'm working with a cube. The problem is that I want to be able to edit the UV mapping in the UV editor and not just have the toolbar on the right suggest an independent cube projection from the one that I created on the left. So what I do is I change these coordinates from generated, or that are internal, to UV, so that it will actually use the UV coordinates within my texture properties rather than using its own generated coordinates. Right, so now I've changed again, the view changes, but now if I go back to the materials preview, I see that the magical image that I've chosen has been mapped to at least 3 faces of that cube. And so now I'm closer to being successful than I was before because I've actually gotten the Blender toolbar to use the UV map that I've created here and to apply it actually to the texture image that I've chosen. So let's do a simple render of this and see what I've got. And the thing is, render image, we're going to see in a couple of seconds. Sure enough, the image has been mapped multiple times onto the cube, which is what I want. This face is dark because the cube assumes, the renderer assumes that there is a light source and that the face on the lower left-hand side of the cube is completely in darkness. In some different project, we might actually want to define multiple light sources, ambient properties, and so forth. Right now, it's beyond the scope of what I want to do. I go back into my 3D view, and I want to point something out. I want to point out 2 observations about this. Some people would say, hey, I've UV mapped a pure cube, and I'm done. I don't have to do anything yet. But this is quite wrong. The UV mapping that it suggested when I told it to unwrap the cube extends beyond the range of the image. Now this is perfectly acceptable because the UV coordinates are not being clamped. So as long as these UV coordinates are not being clamped, this square is roughly in the same position as that square. When texels are being generated that progress beyond the edge of the image, they simply re-enter the image from the opposite side, so that we can very well have a UV mapping that extends beyond the image. But in reality, the whole point of the exercise is that once we've unwrapped our cube, we want to be able to fine-tune the position of each and every vertex on the texture image. So just to get the viewer started with this, I'm going to deselect everything, which is A. And now, because I also have better things to do in life than to remember Blender shortcuts for everything, I'm just going to be very quick about this. I'm going to place the crosshairs on one particular vertex in the UV map editor, and we right-click to select that vertex. Right-click. So now this tiny little vertex has become yellow, whereas the rest of the grid is neutral in color. So the yellow one is the selected one, And under the UV's menu, we have a transform submenu to remind us of what the keyboard shortcuts are. We can go into this submenu and we can tell it that what we want to do for the moment is translate, which will work fine. Or we can just observe that the keyboard shortcut for translate is G, that the keyboard shortcut for rotate is R, and that the keyboard shortcut that I used before for resizing is S. I'm going to try using the keyboard shortcuts here just to see if they work. The vertex that I've selected is still selected. I hit G, and I get to pull this UV point completely out of position from where it's supposed to be, just to prove that there was actually more than one position there. But it's by doing this repeatedly that we would UV map the entire object. So this object has a total of 8 vertices. Well, the thing is that we're going to be working, I mean, in 3D graphics design, we will eventually be working in many more than 8 vertices, so that we have to choose an efficient UV mapping unwrap scheme over here to suggest an initial set of UV coordinates that's consistent with our project. A cube is the simplest thing you can do. For certain other purposes, the cylindrical projection would be a better UV map. The thing to remember is that the sidebar over here actually stores UV coordinates with the binary or with the XML representation of the model file. So what we created when we UV mapped is we created a whole new set of parameters for each of the vertices that are being stored that represent that cube. Whereas over here in the toolbar where we can select a texture, if we tell it that we want this texture to have a projection of any type, we correctly chose UV. If we tell it that we want it to have some other type of generated projection, the information is not stored with the model that we're working on in the 3D view. So that this is good for internally generated parameters that create texture patterns in software rendering. In hardware rendering and in 3D game design, what we really need is we need the UV mapping to tell the game engine how to map a 3D model. So that by repeatedly applying these methods, I can reposition each and every one of my vertices. And the idea, of course, is that we will ultimately want to position them to coincide with the image, right? So we would, if assuming that that's our intention when we're rendering something, I can deselect, I can select the next one, the thing is that this will eventually work. So I can continue these operations until I've repositioned everything where I want it. The thing is, though, it's a dummy exercise. Nobody would really want to map this image to fit onto that cube. But this is the starting point of a UV mapping exercise for a model that's already been defined in 3D. The X, Y, and Z coordinates of this cube are given by the little widget down here. Y goes off to the right. X goes off, it's marked in red where X is, and it's marked in blue where Z is, right? So those are always the two phases of 3D model design. First, you design the model itself in X, Y, and Z, and then you UV map this model to a texture image. And finally, you export it to whatever format your game engine requires, because the purpose of this exercise was that we're not going to use Blender to deliver our content. We're simply going to use it as a model editor. That's the end of my presentation. It's telling me that I haven't saved my changes. Well, this exercise is not that valuable to me, so I quit anyway. Thank you for tuning in, folks.